But first, Daw KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster who regularly helps us out with this kind of stuff. I reckon we can get through this without a row, to be honest, Chris. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian.
You've spoken and written and researched, gone around the world, looking at custody, what it does, custodial sentences, whether they work, whether they don't work. I know you've got a very, emphatic view on this, that you do think for quite a lot of offences, prison just is not the place to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. The prison population, people may be surprised to know, is comprised of 68% of non-violent offenders, so who haven't physically harmed anyone, who are in prison often because of significant mental health disorders, breaches of orders because their lives are chaotic and disorganized, and all sorts of other reasons that have nothing to do with directly harming other people. And of course, much of it to do with the drugs trade as well, which of course is responsible for so much of the prison population and so much crime in this country. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the problem is that every time there's a sort of high-profile incident of almost any kind, we have calls from government for new laws and tougher sentences for people to go to prison for longer, rather than a grown-up conversation about who should really be in prison, because they're needed to be in prison to protect the public, which is what, in my view, prisons are for.
There's a couple of areas that the two that I've sort of settled on is one of Lucy Connolly and the other of Roger Hallam, the Just Stop Oil guy. Now, Gary just messaged in, you probably heard me read that, and says, what do you do with somebody who constantly ignores the courts? They've already got a suspended sentence, they've ignored it again. How do you deal with somebody like that then?
Well, you have to do something different, don't you? Because I mean, one of the things that always amuses me in this situation is when these things happen, where someone is sent to prison and then it doesn't really work, and then they're sent to prison again and it doesn't really work. The argument is, well, we should send them to prison more and for longer. Well, if you sort of took a medication that didn't work every time you used it, you might have a think about whether you might try a new medication. So in this case, the answer is that most of these recidivists either commit offences because of some underlying addiction, mental health problem, or sort of catastrophic life situation, or because they are on some sort of mission to make a point or to campaign for a cause, as you say, such as the environment and people who block the roads and those kinds of things. And they're very different. So if you take someone who's intent on blocking roads and obstructing the public, those people often are not particularly deterred by being sent to prison themselves. And in fact, I've been at court watching some of these environmental cases play out, particularly at Southwark Crown Court, where I spent a lot of time last year. And it's quite frankly, obviously, a form of media protest and a form of deliberately engineered use of the criminal justice system to achieve some degree of martyrdom, to get sympathy from people, or simply just to get publicity, full stop. And I think, the reality is you've got to deprive these people of these things. You've got to deprive them of the publicity that they seek. And you've just got to ensure also that your laws are broadly in line with what makes sense from the public's point of view. And a lot of our criminal laws are not. And so you just get people being locked up for no proper reason.
And going back to the issue of what people do online, during the Southport riots, there was clearly a lot of people went to jail for stuff they said on Facebook or Twitter. Now, this is very specific because it's kind of new in a way, relatively new in the criminal world, that these are words you put onto a social media platform. Some of those words are not very pleasant. Some might be racist. They might be inflammatory, or in the case of Lucy Connolly, incitement to racial hatred was the thing she pleaded guilty to, etc. Firstly, Chris, before we get into that, there's no doubt about it that during the backdrop of riots, sentences were harsher than they might have been had it been written a year before.
Yes, they were, and there were lots of cases that came before the courts in respect of the rioters, which came very quickly before the courts, where there was adequate resource given and court time given to those cases at the expense of rape victims and the victims of other crimes. So that was a classic example where there's this big media furore around, understandably, around the events that took place in Southport. there were thousands of people making ill-informed comments all over the social media, of which Lucy Connolly was just one example. I mean, there were probably millions, but certainly thousands and thousands of people saying utterly inappropriate and deeply offensive things. For me, so what? I don't believe that we should be prosecuting and locking people up for stuff they put on Twitter, particularly not mothers, and particularly not mothers who's I believe she'd even lost a child and had a very traumatic kind of few years leading up to sending what were a series of completely inappropriate and offensive tweets. But come on, putting a mother of children into prison for sending tweets. What on earth is going on when rapists and burglars and all the other criminals who harm people day in, day out, physically, psychologically, and in all sorts of other ways, are not prosecuted at all or sit in a queue for a trial in 4 years' time? The world has literally gone mad.
100%. And of course, what's interesting about these cases is that most of the people, from what I can gather, I can't honestly say all of them, but certainly the ones we seem to cover, the people pleaded guilty. So, did you write that tweet? Yes, I did. I can't deny that. But you're charged with inciting racial hatred. Well, you're a defense lawyer. I'm guessing, Chris, you wouldn't have advised a client to plead guilty to that.
Well, I mean, I can only base it on you've got to remember that inciting racial hatred requires intent. That requires the person to have that specific intention. So, you have to make judgments when you sit down with a client and you hear what they have to say and their explanation for what they've done. It's at that point you say, well, based on what you tell me, I actually do think you probably committed the offence and probably have to plead guilty. Or, well, actually, I know what you said was deeply offensive, but it doesn't appear that you really wanted people to go out there and commit violence against other people. It's a very inappropriate and hostile form of public comment. But at the end of the day, it is comment, and we do have freedom of speech, supposedly, which is being hugely infringed by many of these cases where the police are turning up to arrest people for sending tweets, including children, and people who are trying to look after children who are being arrested because of something they may have said on the spur of the moment on Twitter. And I just think it's all gone too far. Social media is the Wild West. You can't police it. There is no way you can stop people putting things on social media, not least because it's international. So if someone in California or Hong Kong wants to say something deeply offensive on Twitter about someone in England, no one can do anything about it because they're in Hong Kong or America. So the idea that just because you happen to be in Britain, if you send an offensive tweet, they're coming after you with the cops. But if you're, over the other side of the channel when you send the tweet, we're not. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Let social media be a Wild West. Try and keep children off of it as much as possible, particularly the more offensive elements of social media. And otherwise, just treat it as what it is, which is mostly a load of fluff.
That's true, it is. But of course, the obvious example, and I know we don't make law based on the most extreme cases. I think it's called bad law. You'll correct me if I'm wrong there. But
hard cases make bad law.
Yeah, indeed. But if somebody does tweet, Reg, who lives at number 43 Acacia Avenue, I think he's a paedophile. I think you should go round there and smash his door down and kill him. If it is that would surely be
direct incitement to murder. So yes, I mean it wouldn't matter if it was on social media or on the telephone.
Okay,
I mean,
so that's very specific.
Well, it's the way in which you characterise it would clearly be incitement to murder. If you say go and kill this person at this address, that's incitement to murder, and that is a serious crime. We're not talking about that. We're talking, or at least I'm not. I'm talking about situations where people use words which sound threatening or have a sort of nasty overtone or undertone to them, but actually all they're really saying is I don't agree with immigration, or I don't agree with a particular kind of immigration. And I think the problem is that we only tend to police the output, which is kind of contrary, as it were, to the narrative around trying to be tolerant and fair. And the reality is, people are entitled to have very strong, offensive views about immigration. I totally disagree with most of them myself, but I totally respect the right of people to express themselves, even in quite hot-headed and spur-of-the-moment ways, because that's part of the human condition of how people communicate. But you can't, obviously, directly incite violence.
Okay, Chris, very clear stuff. Thank you, as ever, Chris Daw KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster. Let's get a word from Sam.